Welcome to The Breach Show, featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements in Canada. I'm your host, Katia Lo Innes. As US President Donald Trump rolls out increasingly dangerous anti-trans policies south of the border, some are casting Canada as a kind of safe haven for trans and queer people. A recent global report from Ipsos found that support for LGBTQ rights has increased in Canada over the last year as that support has dipped worldwide. But how safe is Canada really for trans and queer people, beyond the headlines and beyond the media spin about Canadian exceptionalism? Celeste Trianon is here to help us dig into that question. Celeste is a trans activist and recent law school graduate, congratulations, currently
Thank you.
living in Jojage, known to many as Montreal. She is the founding director of Julie Trans Legal Clinic, a legal clinic helping trans folk access name and gender marker changes, which is also currently working on litigation to defend the rights of trans youth in Quebec. Welcome back to the show, Celeste.
Thank you.
Celeste, first of all, what do you make of this new poll and suggestion that the support for the rights of LGBTQ plus people is on the rise in Canada? Does that reflect the lived realities for queer and trans communities here?
I will say honestly, Canada has become safer for queer and trans people in the last year or so. What I will say though is that when people say that Canada is, relatively speaking, safer than other countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom, they are correct. Canada absolutely is safer than the US. But what about in absolute terms? What about compared to itself from 3 years ago? That unfortunately paints a starker picture of how things have been evolving in this country. Because what I will say is that whilst there has been some limited advances here and there, especially in Canadian provinces led by, I'll say left of far right governments, unfortunately, there have been many other cases where such far right governments have been explicitly attacking and rolling back these rights. Unfortunately, to the cost of the most marginalized folk under the rainbow, which is, in particular, trans youth and trans women.
You mentioned comparing this relative safeness to a couple years back. Do you want to talk a bit more about that?
I'm just thinking about the times back in particular 2021, 2022, when you could have seen people out in the streets wearing flags. Might be have been wearing, pride flags, trans flags, and like out there in the summer, openly showing themselves as who they are. I've noticed, these signs of just outness, of being openly queer, of being openly present. That unfortunately is just becoming less common nowadays. It's become less and less safe to be out as trans in this road nowadays. People are less comfortable showing themselves as out, and a lot of people have gone back into being in hiding, being closeted or stealth, or just hiding their identities because it's just safer.
Yeah, I went to high school in like the mid 2010s, and I really see that as kind of a golden age of the gender neutral bathroom. It was kind of like welcome to my school with little to no discourse. No one really cared. It was pretty like safe to hang out, and yeah, I can't help but wonder now what's happening.
Mhm. That's very roughly 2014 to I would say 2016 to 2019 is like the peak of the golden age, with like 2014 to 2022 as like a sort of an extended golden age. And
Yeah,
now, relative to that, we're in dark ages again.
yeah. So you mentioned that places like the UK and the US are very not safe for trans people right now. For people who don't really know, Trump signed an executive order in January where he criminalized gender affirming care and even denied the very existence of transgender people. There have been an increase in inquiries from trans Americans about how to move to Canada and, in some cases, claim asylum. At the same time, we see Mark Carney and his proposed so-called Stronger Borders bill, which clamps down on immigration and making it much more difficult to claim refugee status. So, for example, you have to apply within 1 year of entry. Celeste, what do you think about this?
Honestly, please pardon my language. It's fucked up.
Yeah.
But what I will say on a serious note is that this shows a complete and total disregard for the lives of refugees, in particular queer and trans refugees. And by that, I'm not just referring to potential refugees from the United States or de facto refugees coming from such countries, but also folks coming from other places, say Syria, Uganda, Turkey, and like other countries which haven't openly criminalizing or attacking queer and trans people. So in both these cases, whether it be folks from countries with explicit laws criminalizing transness or being queer at large, or closer countries which are maybe not quite at the phase of total criminalization, but are still, openly persecuting trans people. In both these cases, there's no way back. There's no point of return. And say a lot of these folks I know, they will claim refugee status, say 4 or 5 years after first coming to Canada. Maybe because they find out about being queer 4 or 5 years after arriving here. Now, what are we going to take away their right to a fair and free hearing? One that is adjudicated by an independent decider instead of like a so-called pre-removal risk assessment, which is performed simply by CBSA agents with oftentimes no explicit legal training in the matter. Because it just sure feels like we're lowering so significantly the standard of fairness that refugees are entitled to within Canada. These people deserve a minimum of fairness, of impartiality, as deciders decide on whether their home country is safe or no to go back to. And the same goes for folks who are, say, fleeing here in the US, where that be, folks who might have lived in the US for like 20, 30 years without becoming citizens, or even US citizens themselves trying to flee to Canada. What about them? What makes them less entitled to claiming refugee status, despite the fact that they might be even more in danger in the US than in their country of origin? C2 exists in a complete legal fiction, and that legal fiction is the fiction that the US is a safe third country. And this relies on the fiction that both the US and Canada are safe third countries, quote unquote, to claim asylum in. But unfortunately, it's no longer true for the US. So the whole premise of this agreement has fallen apart. Yet because the agreement still stands, people are still, being denied entry at the border, turned back away to the US, and potentially in the hands of ICE agents.
You mentioned earlier that kind of Bill C2 is changing the limits of what's acceptable for a refugee to be treated as. We've seen a normalization and I guess a way of accepting right-wing anti-trans narratives across Canada. So while certain governments aren't necessarily doing anything to endanger trans people, they don't seem to be doing enough to shut down transphobic talking points. An example of this is the recent report in Quebec from the Comité des sages sur l'identité du genre, which translates in English to the Committee of Wise Men on Gender Identity, which is LOL. Yeah, Celeste, can you tell us briefly more about this report and what it recommends and why it matters?
Absolutely. So, some context. The report was first commissioned by the Quebec government after a pair of moral panics in September 2023. One over a teacher using a mixed title, another moral panic around the gender neutral washrooms in schools, and another moral panic being the massive September 20th, 2023 coordinated anti-trans protests all across the country, including one massive protest in Montreal that for many people in the local trans community have been one of the most traumatizing days in their life so far. So in a way, it is just twisting a knife in a wound because of just how this who reports commission as a way to sort of like quote unquote be neutral and find middle ground between trans people themselves and the people who seek to exterminate them from society. And that is the status quo which is being pushed forward by the Quebec government. So this report was charged on, on analyzing trans issues. It's three people who have had no prior knowledge nor expertise in working with trans people, but who do have knowledge in other fields, for example, medicine, law, and nursing, respectively. So you can imagine what that standpoint comes from. So you met with different, trans groups, broader queer groups, women's rights groups, TERF groups, anti-trans groups, basically everyone, and under the cover of giving everyone anonymity, they just collected all of their testimonies and decided to make a report out of it. So it is once again, claiming that the Earth is somehow a cylinder because people are debating between whether it's flat or it's round. And that's pretty much what it summarizes at the end of the day, which is why you end up with a report which honestly has no credibility whatsoever. But as for the report itself, whilst it gets into some issues, fairly accurately, that I will give, and it very much touches on the fact that trans discrimination is real, is present. There's no denial of that. nonetheless attempts to drive a wedge, in particular, between the rights of trans women and of cis women, notably claiming that trans women's rights automatically endanger cis women's rights, when in fact they tend to work in tandem with each other in a symbiotic manner. So there's a lot of, these false, affirmations which have been just taken into account. And there's even with other times, for example, with other parts of the report, for example, with women's shelters, where said committee recommends, potentially even creating exceptions altogether to Quebec's human rights charter in order to exempt certain facilities from the requirement to not discriminate on the basis of gender identity, which is honestly ridiculous. I cannot say that this is a report which will not endanger queer and trans people's rights, because it clearly will, in particular for trans women.
You've written on your blog that reports like this basically serve to manufacture consent for transphobia.
Absolutely. And I'll give you another example. The CAS report was cited at length by the Alberta government in order to justify its anti-transgender affirming care ban in court. So you can imagine these reports, which are meant to be like these broader, maybe like analysis reports, oftentimes written with anti-trans biases, end up becoming legal documents that are cited ad nauseam and internationally in order to justify attacks on gender affirming care. Because let's face it, the anti-trans movement is an international movement. It might have roots in the US and the UK, but it has spread like wildfire all across the world, whether that be on continental Europe, in Canada, in Mexico, and so many other countries across the world.
The Quebec government also announced that it's enacting a directive that would jail inmates by biological sex and not gender identity. Mind you, trans people make, I think, 0.1% of the provincial prison population.
Pretty much.
So it's
Well, you
six
can count them
people.
on two hands.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's six people. And yeah, Celeste, what's the deal with this? How did we have such a big response that's going to affect such a small and marginal group in prisons?
So basically, it's a moral panic. It all happened because there was this one prisoner, Lavana Albayus, who, after committing murder, has basically decided to transition while in pre-sentencing jail. So basically came out, did get transferred to a women's prison, and the news somehow got leaked to right-wing media, who ended up creating a moral panic about it, which ended up getting picked up by PFWF, who then integrated banning trans women from women's prisons into the Conservative Party of Canada's platform. It was on their electoral platform. 3 mentions of the word woman amongst 5 total mentions in that platform were concerning repealing the federal Commissioner's Directive 100 regarding, like allowing trans inmates to transfer depending on their gender identity, subject to so-called health and safety concerns. So it isn't even considered an absolute right, unlike with, say, cis women, where like they would absolutely be sent to women's prison even if they're the most horrific person on earth. There's a double standard going on here. And the Quebec government just basically picked up on that and said, hey, we're going to slice based on your genitals, which means if you have a vagina, you go to the women's prison. If you have a penis, you go to a men's prison. And beyond that, too, it takes absolutely not into account what gender someone presents, like in day-to-day life, how they appear, how they look, etc. So, say in my case, because I have had gender affirming surgery, I would be safe if I were ever to be jailed under this policy. I'd be sent to a women's prison, but not all trans people get these surgeries. So it'd be basically a lot of, people who might have, might say their faces might look even more feminine than mine. They might end up sent to a men's jail where they could be subject to the risk of sexual assault. There is a very real risk of cruel and unusual treatment here. It's like bringing, let's say, a full blown hammer in order to, say, kill a spider. That's how disproportionate it is.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Pierre Poilievre picked up on this. So, when these anti trans and transphobic narratives and activists are given platforms and legitimized by Canadian lawmakers, there can be, as you said, very dangerous consequences. And yeah, going back to last year, after the September 2023 protests, we saw some very severe anti trans bills enacted in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So, recently in Alberta, a judge put a hold on the law that would ban doctors from providing gender affirming
Yeah.
care to youth.
Mhm. So the Alberta government is already planning on appealing. Apparently, their whole strategy right now is to exhaust all recourse before using the non-standing clause because they don't want to appear like they are breaching trans youth equality rights and right to life, liberty, and equality of the person, which are sections 15 and 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You can see behind me. And pretty much it's all about attempting under the guise of protecting these youth to deny them equality, to deny them opportunities, and to deny these youth equal treatment under the law. It's all about setting them apart and saying that because you're trans, you don't have autonomy, nor should your parents, nor should your doctors. The whole Alberta government suggested choosing the outstanding clause here sounds awfully like back in 1998. So there's a court case in Alberta subsequent to Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act, which was active between 1928 and I believe 1972, whereas the Alberta government forcibly sterilized hundreds of thousands of women, in particular Indigenous women, and one of these women ended up suing the government, was given a reward somewhere in the high six figures, and the Alberta government started panicking and decided to introduce a bill capping recourse at $150,000 and using the notwithstanding clause to say that sorry, or we won't. That despite the charter, you cannot sue for more, and that got so much outrage that the bill was canceled the next day. But this smells awfully like the same thing, like a government trying to, after committing effectively state mandate medical malpractice, that this is not something that's recourseable, that this is something that is, that we are good, that we say what's good for you, and we're not going to allow you to have any more than that. So if this passes with an outstanding clause, I do suspect that there are going to be internally displaced trans people and their families within Canada. These same people currently who might be living, say, in Calgary or in Edmonton, might be forced to instead live in, like, say, Vancouver or Winnipeg instead because they have no choice, because they need access to their health care. And if that sounds a bit ridiculous, if that sounds un-Canadian to you, it's because it is ridiculous. It is un-Canadian. Yet, it is yet again government deciding what's best for people despite no one asking for it and despite it being completely contrary to the principles underlying human rights law.
Now we see trans issues becoming not just a moral panic, but a bargaining chip. So in the UK, the Supreme Court recently ruled that gender is based upon biological sex. The Trump administration was pushing the UK Labour government to repeal its LGBTQ plus hate speech laws to secure a trade deal. As you mentioned, transphobia within the UK has long existed, but this tariff war and Trump's anti-trans laws are really bringing this into focus. And we've seen Carney make all sorts of concessions to Trump in recent weeks.
Including altogether, repealing a tax in order to bow down to Trump. Basically, Trump is in control of Canadian tax law right now.
Yeah, he canceled the digital services tax recently. The UK still has theirs. Do you think there's a danger that LGBTQ rights could be on the table here as well?
Absolutely. And let's just say it. Trump definitely is angry right now that trans people are fleeing to Canada. We're talking in the US about hundreds of thousands at the minimum of internally displaced trans persons. Hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons. That is a refugee crisis. Yet people will not recognize that as such because trans people are not historically considered, a group which can be like internally displaced to such an extent. And we're seeing more and more this internal displacement translating itself to external displacement. If you count, what I would call invisible refugees or like de facto refugees, people who are here under, say, under anything ranging from, work permits and student visas on the way to permanent residence and even like citizenship by descent or basically unused Canadian citizenship up to this point. People who have fled here under these grounds, we're talking about at least thousands of trans American Canadians. I'll say it this way. We're talking about thousands of displaced people. And Trump is certainly not happy at that. So I do suspect there is a possibility that, that trans rights could be on the bargaining chip next, that the conversion therapy ban could end up being repealed because the US government now is clearly engaging in conversion therapy and does not want its citizens to end up being held to account in a court of law for basically committing torture. And I do suspect, that given how Trump has decided that, well, has not just decided, but has succeeded in getting an entire Canadian tax repealed for the sake of a trade deal, what tells me that it's not going to happen to queer and trans people's civil rights next? Where is the line? And I will say, the broader anti-trans movement. So it's also more academic circles. We call it the anti-gender movement. Is funded by billions upon billions of dollars. It's funded by oil and gas executives. It's funded by right wingers all across the road. It's funded even just by the pockets of like just mainstream conservatives. It's massively well funded. So in the US, you have many big names like the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Heritage Foundation. All these are listed as listed by different groups such as the Talent Poverty Law Center as anti-queer extremist groups. Here in Canada, you also have a few, most notably COSBAR, so Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights. By the way, that is an anti-trans dog whistle. So there's no such thing as sex-based rights in law, yet it is used as an excuse to make something appear like it's legal. So they're currently attempting to force the Canadian federal government to jail people on their anatomy or sex sign of birth. And of course, you have the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, which is a far right group whose former president once got convicted of effectively stalking a judge. Imagine that. So anti-COVID-19 measure group turned anti-trans group, which by the way, they're also currently bankrolling said called the Cosvar lawsuit against CB100 and are also backing a lawsuit here in Quebec concerning trans kids in schools. They are able to lobby to an extent that trans people never could imagine. And that's the thing. These hate groups have disproportionate power over our lives and our existence. And they use all sorts of avenues, whether it be, through pure fear mongering, attempting to manipulate media, which I will say they've been extremely successful at doing that in the US, in particular with the New York Times, which has been one of the most complicit media outlets in anti-trans lobbying in, I'd say, even history. And, all these other news outlets are all, part of the broader anti-trans movement. They have all joined in. They've all decided that, platforming hate is fair game. And here in Canada, it's no exception. You have outlets like in particular the National Post, which is by the way US owned, which
They're owned by a New Jersey hedge fund.
of course,
The Post Media is.
yep. So in particular National Post, constantly puppeting anti-trans voices when they'll always refuse to publish trans people themselves. And so many studies have shown that one of the biggest factors in determining whether someone is going to be inclusive towards trans people or no is whether they know a trans person or not. And that's why book bans and such other attempts at banning knowledge altogether are so effective. It's because the far right doesn't want anyone knowing that trans people can even exist. It's why they use epistemicide as a rhetorical tactic. So erasure of knowledge as a tactic. For example, claiming trans kids don't exist, that they're just mentally ill, or they'll use terms such as gender dysphoric kids instead of trans kids. They'll purposely shape language, so newspeak in a way, in order to create this. I will say, unfortunately, a lot of these conservative movements, people are not aware of them growing domestically, but Canada has historically been a hotbed for like a lot of, at least a lot of like media stuff when it comes to the far right. And it clearly shows currently with how, these policies are advancing. Which is why, for example, in BC, I believe, last year, it was before the BC provincial elections, there's a bill to ban trans women from women's sports that was introduced but quickly shut down in the BC legislature. And though this year there's now an intention by the BC Conservatives to introduce a parental rights quote unquote book ban bill as well. So we're seeing a lot of, patterns from American anti-trans legislation being copy pasted over to Canada. We're seeing a lot of the same things and also the same legal defenses as well for said legislation. So, despite the fact that we do have a Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms here, and the Supreme Court of Canada has affirmed that, gender identity is a protected grounds under Section 15 of the Canadian Charter, it's still somehow not enough to keep trans people protected. And that's because there are these hate groups attempting to undermine these protections as we speak.
We talked about Pierre Poilievre, and I think obviously myself, I had been preparing for a Poilievre conservative government, but instead we have Carney's government. And we've just gone through his first 100 days. I was wondering what you thought and what you're watching in the days to come.
Honestly, one thing I'm seeing is that Carney might be someone who supports the Canadian Charter in name, but only in name and not in practice. He did very much say do an impassioned defense of the Canadian Charter when Poilievre suggested using the notwithstanding clause to jail people like Alexandre Bissonnette in jail without the possibility of parole, which is impossible under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So Carney did defend the Canadian Charter very strongly at this moment, saying it is meant to protect people from politicians like himself. And honestly, it is currently serving to protect us Canadians from politicians like Carney. So far he's been true to his words, but for how much longer? That's the question. Can we take for granted that the charter is going to be upheld by our government? Which I will say, unfortunately, is no longer something you can take as much for granted as we used to. So what I'm watching for primarily is how far will the current government go in denying these same civil rights and, introducing legislation which clearly is unconstitutional before he stops. And maybe I'll say on a closing note here too. It's that things right now they don't look hopeful at all, but there are people on the ground doing good work. There are people fighting a good fight. If you don't know where to get started in order to defend trans community members, you can get started with honestly any fight for social justice. Whether it be one against, against racial profiling, for refugee rights, for all these other civil rights out here. You can at least begin with that. You can join those fights because any fight for civil rights is a fight for trans rights. And if you want to specifically help trans folk, don't be afraid to reach out to different trans groups all across the country, really. Even if, say, you're a parent to a trans kid and you don't know where to get started, reach out to folks around you and make sure to have an open ear and an open mind because listening is really the best way you can help is to listen because that's what makes a difference in this world. It's people listening to each other and doing things for the good, for the better good.
Well, thank you so much for ending on that hopeful note, even though you started by saying there was not much.
It's such a
But
pleasure.
if you like what you've heard on The Breach Show, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to support our work, please become a sustaining member to help us produce more journalism for transformation. You can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thanks for listening.